Welcome to Women on Wealth. This is episode 98. I'm Julina Ogilvie. And today we're diving into a topic that's both timeless, it's incredibly powerful, and it's all around storytelling, not just as a form of expression, but as a strategic tool for communication and business success. And joining me is Sara Gómez, a passionate storyteller, communication expert, business strategist who helps individuals and companies harness the power of narrative to connect, influence, and grow. Whether you're looking to elevate your brand, inspire your team, communicate more effectively with clients, her insights can show you how storytelling can become your most valuable asset. So, Sara, welcome.
Thanks, Julina. It is great to be here with you and to be here with everyone who's listening.
Yeah, I'm so excited. And I don't even know if I told you, but one of my nicknames in college was storyteller. I don't think I was really effective. I think I just
Really?
rambled on, but it's
I love it.
so I'm really looking forward to learning how to be more effective, a more effective storyteller today. So I appreciate you joining me. I guess to start, well, first tell me a little bit about your background and how you chose to use this as a profession.
Sure, sure. So, as you already said, I'm a storyteller and I've always been passionate about storytelling because of its power to connect us and help us see each other's humanity. I have had this really interesting life where I've grown up and lived and worked all over the world. My mom is from the US, my dad's from Colombia, and I have spent more than 20 years working in global health. I've lived in places like India, Mexico, Brazil, Cyprus.
Amazing.
And,
And where are
you
you
know,
today?
and so now I live in Italy, actually.
Jealous.
That's where I am right now. And it's a beautiful place to be.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, one of the things that really struck me in my work with nonprofits is just again and again, I saw these amazing projects, amazing, powerful work that was happening,
Mm.
and yet so few people hearing about it.
Mm.
And I thought about, how much more impact could we have if people knew what we were doing? If they understood it and they could support it and they could be part of it, how much could it grow? How much could the impact grow? And that is one of the things that's led me to storytelling. So, what I do now is really just helping people create stories that help themselves be heard and get themselves out there and capture attention and build whatever they want to build.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and I know we're going to talk about this, but I think one of the challenges is we all know our own internal stories and we would love to share it, but just how to actually position it and put it together can be quite challenging, right? So,
Definitely.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, telling your own story is one of the hardest things to do.
Yeah. So, so why is storytelling such a powerful communication tool? And I guess, is there anything that neuroscience can tell us about its impact?
Yeah, no, I mean, neuroscience has a lot to say about the power of storytelling, right? So our brains are wired for stories, and we remember stories so much more than just facts or data, and they
Statistics,
say even
numbers.
22 times more, stories are 22 times more memorable than data and facts alone. People, as much as we would like to think that people make decisions based on logic and facts, the truth of the matter is that people make decisions primarily based on emotions,
Emotions.
right?
Yeah.
And storytelling is one of the most powerful ways to engage people's emotions. And there is a neuroscientist called Paul Zak, and he's actually done a lot of research around storytelling and the neuroscience behind it. And without going into all of the
Yeah.
details, one of the important things there is that when people listen to stories that make them feel hopeful and connected, the brain releases oxytocin.
Mm.
And oxytocin, a lot of us may have heard of it, but it's also known as the love hormone. And it's a
Ah,
hormone builds empathy, it builds trust and connection. And they've done studies with nonprofits also that show when people listen to stories and oxytocin is released, they're much more likely to donate. Um,
Hmm.
they're more likely to want to connect, say, with companies that use storytelling. So it creates that possibility of connection.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, you can get really real results from storytelling. It's not just some fluffy extra. I would say
Yeah.
it is absolutely essential. And
How,
it just really, storytelling taps into what makes us human and it moves people to
yeah.
action, right?
And
They even, they've shown that nonprofits that prioritize storytelling have much higher retention rates for
huh,
donor than those who don't.
interesting. So in today's fast-paced world where attention spans are incredibly short and getting shorter, how can good storytelling help a message stand out and be remembered?
That is a really good question because, yeah, right now it's pretty chaotic times. Attention spans are super fragmented. And honestly, I would say storytelling, it makes the difference between whether your message is even seen,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
So I would say, it makes a difference whether a message is remembered, but first it has to even be seen, right? It needs to be noticed.
Yeah.
And they say that on social media, you have of about 3 seconds to capture people's attention. And
Mind
that if
blowing.
someone's looking, let's say, at your website, you have about 10 or 15 seconds. So
Okay.
you think about with this tiny amount of time. I mean, I don't even honestly know if it's that much. You think about when you're scrolling and how
Yeah.
much time do you spend deciding, okay, where are you going to stop and
Mm-hmm.
pause?
Yeah.
And so how you capture people's attention, it's about that first phrase, that powerful sentence,
Hmm.
that photograph that you're using, the tones, the color. I mean,
Mm.
just as an example, I made a LinkedIn post, a few weeks ago that didn't get a lot of engagement. And I was looking back at it and I said, okay, I'm going to switch it around. And I pulled a sentence from the middle that was more powerful than the other sentence I had started it with. So I kind of flipped it.
Mm.
I switched the photograph. I put something that was a little brighter, a little more catchy. And it completely changed the
Hmm.
amount of engagement that it got.
Really? Okay.
So there's little things, I think,
Which
I
is
mean, if
interesting
we
because
don't catch,
also we jump so quickly. Sorry, we jump so quickly sometimes to put things on social media. I mean, I do it all the time without really thinking
yeah,
about it.
yeah,
So,
totally. No, so do I. So do I.
yeah.
And as a storyteller, I'll put things up there and then I'll look at it and I'll be like, you know what?
Mm.
That's not the sentence I needed to
Yeah.
start that with. And then, you can always experiment and switch it around. But I think the moral of the story is if you, yeah, if you don't capture people's attention, then it doesn't matter how amazing and how brilliant
Yeah.
all the rest of what you say is, because if someone doesn't pause to read it, they're not going to hear it, they're not going to look at it. So that's kind of the
And it's got to be quick.
key. And it's got to be quick
Yeah. Okay.
and powerful and clear.
Yeah. And do you have examples of how storytelling can build trust and credibility? Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, before, giving an example, I would talk a little bit just in general about how storytelling builds trust, right? And how it makes people, for example, drawn to you and whatever you're putting out there in the world, your value, if you have a service that you're providing, if you have a company or, a nonprofit, when somebody hires you, it's not just because of what you do. You think about it, whatever you do, there's probably lots of other people out there that do
Right.
the same thing. So
Mhm.
why are they going to hire you over someone else or choose your company or your organization? And it's because of who you are. It's because of your lived experience. It's because of your personality
Yeah.
and your approach, right? And but people are not going to know what your personality and approach
Mhm.
and, experience is if you don't tell them that.
Right.
And, they say if you don't tell your story, someone else will. And even worse than that is not even having well, we don't know if it's worse, but not having your story told at all, right?
Right.
So, I mean, storytelling, it's one of the most powerful ways to build trust and credibility. And these are authentic
Mhm.
relationships because it helps people understand who you, your company, your organization, who you are,
Mhm.
right? And
Yeah.
just to give an example, give my own example, right? I do storytelling, and there's so many people, so many other people who do storytelling,
Hmm.
but then I tell people about my particular lived experience,
Hmm.
my approach. I've lived all over the world. I'm bilingual in English and Spanish. I've done, this high level work with, organizations like Save the Children, WHO, and I've done work with local communities, participatory storytelling with folks in Bolivia, in India, and I'm passionate about social change, about narrative change.
Yeah.
So not all storytellers are going to have that same,
Sure.
perspective and way of doing things,
Absolutely.
and people will choose me because that's what
Right.
they're drawn to, right? So I could just put up a website that talks about, I can help you create powerful stories, and this is the power of storytelling. But if I don't tell you who I am
Mhm.
and the way I do it and what I do,
Yeah.
uh, it's not going to have the same impact. So
Do you have an example, Sarah, of a client that sort of resonated with you on how you were able to help them create that storytelling within their process?
I have an example that was very early in my career that is a little bit different, but it helps. It was that moment when I saw
Mm,
someone else see the power of
yeah.
storytelling. And this was when I was right out of college. I went to work in India with an organization called the Self-Employed Women's Association.
Mm,
And I was doing, documentary photography and writing for their childcare program to show, the value of that program. And I spent weeks and months speaking with parents and kids and teachers about, what was the impact of that program for them.
sure.
And at the very, end of my stay, we put some of these stories into the grant report.
Hmm.
And the feedback that we got from the funder was that it was the first time that they had actually finally understood what the organization did and the
Mm,
impact of what they did. Because we told stories,
yeah.
about, for example, what was it like for women before they had access to the childcare centers, and they would take their toddlers with them to tobacco factories. They would take them to the fields where it was 120 degrees. They would
Oh,
leave their kids at home by themselves and hope that the neighbors would check in on them.
mm,
And if you think about that,
yeah.
as a parent,
Oh,
that would be like versus knowing that they're being taken care of,
yes.
that they're getting a meal, that they're learning something.
Mhm. Yeah.
And, being able to show that difference and show it from the perspectives and the experiences of the people who are experiencing,
Yeah.
that impact was powerful. And it was amazing to hear the organization say
Yeah.
that,
I can see how that can be so impactful. Thank you for sharing that. And so a lot of people struggle with this communication and kind of how to convey these ideas. So how can storytelling take these complicated topics, make them more accessible and compelling? And I maybe this is a follow-up to the story you just shared, if you have another angle to kind of explain that.
Yeah, no, I do actually. And I think that is another really powerful thing about storytelling is that, and it goes back to that, the fact that it is really hard to describe to people what we do and the value of what we do simply because we know too much. We're
Okay.
deep inside of it, and
Yeah.
that gets in our way,
Okay.
right? We go into too much detail. We say more than we need to. A lot of the time we're dealing with complex issues, complex problems, right? And the challenge that I often see, both in my own work and in other people's work, is just the difficulty of of talking about these things in a way
Yeah.
that's understandable and that's
You want to be
simple.
perceived as the expert.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly, right? And so we get bogged down by details and
Totally.
jargon, and people just tune out and we lose opportunities, right?
Sure.
And I would say, even because you talk about, oh, you want this to you want this to be clear so that everyday people can understand.
Mhm.
But honestly, nobody wants to wade through like dense reports and complex data.
Mhm.
Everybody appreciates clarity, simplicity, right?
Yes.
Engaging communications. So
Mhm.
I'll give you an example. I was working with a project it was based in Nigeria, and it was a colleague who was developing an app to help folks with disabilities access um, banking services,
Hmm.
right? So an app that would sort of make those
Yeah.
links and help out with those places that the bank just didn't have the capacity,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
And I was, in a virtual call with my colleague who was talking to an investor, a potential investor, right? Because this was kind of a startup.
Hmm.
And he was talking to the investor about the idea and what they were building and, all kinds of data and, this many people in Nigeria
Yeah.
facing disabilities. These are the kinds of disabilities people have. These are the kinds of challenges they face. But when I saw the investors or the potential investors' eyes light up the most is when my colleague told him a story. And he told him a story about a woman who was deaf and she had traveled to another country and her credit card was stolen. And she did what any of us would do is you
Hmm.
call the bank, you want to cancel your card and get
Sure.
another copy of the card so you can figure out how to get
Yeah.
back to to where you're traveling or whatever. But when she called the bank, because she was deaf, the bank didn't have the capacity to, verify her identity
Oh,
and they didn't
wow.
have, it just couldn't be done. And
Yeah.
so it was very, very complex and challenging. And you can just imagine how
Yes.
stressful that can be.
Absolutely.
Someone's stolen your card, you're in another country, you don't know what to do, and the bank says, I can't help you because we can't verify your identity, right?
Yeah.
And I
Yep.
think, a story like that helps people understand on a deeper level,
Yeah.
on an emotional level, and helps people relate with their own experience,
Yeah.
something that someone who may be different from them or may have a different lived
Yeah. For
experience.
me, as you explained the app, I was like, I think I get it. And then when you said the
Exactly.
story, I'm like, okay, now maybe I don't understand how it completely works, but I understand at least one part of it now. And to me, it's so fascinating that you said the investors lit up with this story because usually the investors are the ones that are just honing in on the facts and figures and statistics and profitability and yet the story seems to be what really got them. So I love that.
Right, because it helped them understand, okay, this is the value of what this
Hmm.
brings.
Yeah.
This is the type of problem that it helps to solve. And so
Yeah.
I thought
And
that was
but the value isn't always based on numbers.
exactly.
Yeah, no, I love it. And you mentioned that sharing, personal business challenges through storytelling can build confidence. And so, can you share an example of how that's worked, either maybe from a personal standpoint, business standpoint, whatever you can share.
Sure. Yeah, I'll talk about it from a personal perspective. I I started posting on LinkedIn a couple of years ago. I
Mhm.
realized, that I had been putting myself out there as a storyteller and I hadn't told my story. I hadn't been sharing my own story. So I started, I
Okay.
started
Funny how that works.
trying it out. Yeah, I know, right? And honestly, the more I shared, the more comfortable I became sharing my own narrative, and the more clear I became on it,
Yeah.
right? Um, and the more clearly that you can, start sharing your own narrative, the more
Hmm.
confidence you have in sharing it.
Yeah.
And, the other thing was just when I was putting my story out there and then seeing people resonating with that and seeing the value
Mm.
in who I am and what I do, that also helped build confidence. And I think,
Yeah.
something important about telling the nuanced stories that also encompass the messiness of life. We need to talk about the challenges and, everything that it takes to get us there and
Yeah.
not just the wins and,
Right. Yeah.
the
I think
amazing things that happen to us, because that also helps us all understand that we're all on this journey and we're all just figuring it out.
agree. People don't necessarily want to look on social media just to see everyone's successes all the time.
Exactly,
They want to see
exactly.
real world situation. And to the point about the social media and the platforms and everything that's available today, from a marketing perspective, some people are really good at tweaking the nuances of posting on LinkedIn versus Instagram, TikTok, whatever. So how does someone adapt their storytelling amongst the different platforms?
So the first thing that I would say, and this is, what any communications expert is going to say, is that first you have to know your audience, right? Before we even start adapting to different platforms,
Yeah,
because we need to know who we're talking to. We need to know what they care about, what tone resonates with them, what kind of
sure.
language is going to feel familiar and engaging and speak to them, right?
Mhm. Yeah,
So that's sort of the first step. And then like you said, we need to adapt the story that we're telling to fit the different platform, whatever platform we're using.
yeah,
And that can be a change in length, in tone, in format. And I think, obviously, social media has to be short, it has to be sweet, it has to capture your attention in less than 3 seconds.
crazy.
And it needs images and all of these things. And then there's spaces like an article or a blog post where you can go deeper into things. And I think combining these, are are a good way. Like you can have a post on LinkedIn or on Facebook or whatever, wherever you want to catch people's attention, and then give a
Yeah,
link to a blog where people can read more about things. If you want to use video, that's, I
yeah,
think, something that I would say is that you don't need to be an expert in every format, right?
yes,
Choose the ones that you feel familiar with. And if you have, the capacity to hire someone who is an expert, with social media or making videos,
yeah. It's so time
then
consuming.
do it, I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
but yeah, I mean, I think that that's sort of one of the things that it's really reaching out and getting help
Hmm.
and support
Yeah.
with all of this is key.
Okay. Yeah, but once you create that story, right, you can figure out how it may be tweaked on different platforms or social media
Exactly.
versus in person versus a blog, whatever it is.
Exactly. I mean, like you said, that is the first step
Hmm.
is getting clear on the story, figuring out that core story and then building from there. You get the
Okay.
core story, you have to know your audience, and then you can build it out into different formats and different.
Okay. Is this part of the conversation that you have with clients?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think, when I start my conversation and that kind of discovery session with the client,
Yeah.
it always starts with
Mm,
finding out who their audience is,
okay.
what it is that that they're hoping to do. And
Hmm.
when we go into their story, we start finding, what is that gold that's hiding in there that they
Yeah.
might not even recognize that's
That triggers
value
that
in what they
emotion.
do and who they are.
Okay. Got it. It seems so simple to be able to share a story, right? And yet for most of us, it's just so difficult. So What advice do you have for those that are going through this process right now and they're trying to craft that story of their own,
So,
aside from come to talk to you?
I mean, I think it just goes back to don't be afraid to reach out for help
Mhm.
because telling your own story is really difficult for the reasons that we talked about.
Yeah.
And you don't have to spend a fortune. You can get help and support in
Mhm.
whatever way fits your budget.
Yeah.
You can even just start by, find someone you trust who knows you really well, maybe someone you've worked with, like or a friend, a
Right.
mentor, a colleague, and ask them to just simply listen.
Hmm.
And you can tell them what you think your story is in whatever messy way you want to start,
Yeah.
Don't worry about it, just talk. And then ask them to reflect back on what they hear in your story. Ask them what they see in you,
Mm.
what feels valuable, memorable, unique about me. What would you come to me for?
Mm.
Things
Okay.
like that. You ask, there's questions that we can ask people that we can get really beautiful answers out of that help us see value in ourselves that we didn't even recognize was
Yeah.
there. And so I would say, I mean, when I first started my business, one of the smartest things that I did was to get help. And I mean, I'm a storyteller. I do this for other people, but it doesn't
Sure.
mean that I can do it easily for myself,
Yeah.
right?
Absolutely.
Because,
And
like I said, I know too much about myself. I don't know where to start,
mhm.
and there's gifts that I have that I didn't even recognize were valuable, right? Because
Yeah.
also, even just like with that own kind of lack of confidence,
Hmm.
things about myself that I didn't even recognize
Yeah.
were gifts and were
Absolutely.
things that I
And it's funny, you and I were talking about this before we hit the record button. You and I met through the Indie Collective program. And one of the things they do there is, you take business owners, entrepreneurs, professionals, and you break them into these cohorts that you have a team of individuals that you can lean on and you can ask for guidance. And I was complaining that I don't attend those enough. And you're reminding me that that's the reason you go and you attend them. It's because so you need someone to lean on, whether it's a professional organization like that or just, family, friends, colleagues, etc. So that's a great point. Thank you.
Well, yeah, and speaking of, just the context of Indie Collective that you're talking about, one of the things that has been helpful for me when
Hmm.
I go to those meetings is that often we need to really quickly tell someone, okay, what we do and what's the value of that, and then we have to jump into some other complex
Yes,
question, right? And it's still hard for me
a
to
hundred
just
percent.
jump in and say who I am, what I do really fast to
Yeah,
someone I've just met,
exactly. Yeah.
And the more we do that, the better we get at it.
Hmm.
And that can be just such a powerful tool to connect with the people that we need to connect
Yeah,
with, right? So when you own
absolutely.
your own story, you own your own power. And then when you share it, you open the door for
Hmm.
the right people to find you, to trust you, and to work with you.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that, that goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that confidence, because I know I'm not the only financial advisor. It's shocking. And so when you're introducing yourself so quickly to especially other professionals that are successful, it can be intimidating. So the storytelling helps.
Yeah, and just, I mean, I think one of the things that I would say is just start. Don't wait for things to be perfect. Just try it out. Because the other thing about chaotic, busy world is that, people are not paying attention. So if you say something that feels, silly to you and you're like, oh my goodness, I can't believe I shared that, nobody's going to care anyway. Just share things, see
Yes.
what sticks. And yeah,
I think that's a great point. Don't wait for the perfection.
yeah, don't be too precious. Just
Okay.
just try it. Just try it because the other thing is your story isn't static. It evolves as you grow.
Hmm.
And honestly, telling your story helps it evolve.
Yeah,
You know,
absolutely.
by telling my own story, I have been able to reflect in a way that I wouldn't have if I just kept it all inside my head.
Hmm. Absolutely. Uh,
So,
Thank you, Sarah. Where can people that want to learn more find you?
So
I know you're
you
on
can
LinkedIn because you mentioned that a couple times.
Yeah, I mean, LinkedIn, honestly, and on social media, LinkedIn is what I mainly use
Okay.
for my storytelling and my business, honestly. So
Okay.
I think you're going to put
Yes.
the
I will
link
add that in.
there.
Mhm.
And I encourage people to connect with me there. I'm always happy to talk about storytelling.
Okay. Yeah.
And like I said, I help people with storytelling in lots of different ways. So
Okay.
I'm always happy to.
Yeah, I can confirm you're open to conversations and you're an open book. So,
Yeah, and then also, I mean, my website, which I think you'll share,
Mhm.
just says a little bit
Okay.
more about, what I do and how I do it and that sort of thing.
And
But
name your website real quick.
it's www.saragomezconsulting.com.
SarahGomezConsulting.com. Okay, great.
That's Sarah without an H.
Yep. Sarah, it was a pleasure. It's always good to see you, and we appreciate the insights. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me on the podcast.